Pullman was not merely a factory built of brick, steel, and steam, but an experiment in control carried out at the height of America's industrial rise. Conceived in the late 19th century, it became the nation's first true company town, a place where a single corporation extended its authority far beyond the factory gates to shape nearly every aspect of daily life. In Pullman, the company owned the homes workers lived in, the streets they walked on, the markets where they shopped, and even the rules that governed their behavior. To its supporters, this was progress, a carefully planned industrial community designed to replace urban chaos with order, cleanliness, and stability. To critics, it was something more unsettling, a system in which freedom existed only within boundaries defined by corporate power. Workers were promised steady wages and safe living conditions, but they were denied ownership, autonomy, and the right to shape their own environment. Every paycheck circulated back into the same system that issued it, binding labor and livelihood into a single, inescapable loop. Pullman was celebrated by industrialists and reformers as a model for the future of American industry, a city without strikes, without unrest, and without disorder. Yet beneath its orderly streets and uniform facades lay a fragile illusion, one that depended on obedience and silence to survive. When economic pressure and human frustration began to test that system, Pullman would transform from a symbol of industrial optimism into a warning about the limits of corporate control, a place where the promise of order would collide with the reality of power, and where the story of America's first company town would reveal a darker truth about the cost of building progress on control rather than consent. Chapter 1. The Man Behind the City, George Mortimer. Pullman was not born into wealth or privilege, but he would become one of the most influential industrial figures of 19th century America, a man whose vision reshaped not only transportation, but the lives of tens of thousands of workers. Born in 1831 in upstate New York, Pullman grew up witnessing the restless expansion of a young nation driven by canals, railroads, and machines. And from an early age, he developed a fascination with engineering solutions that promised efficiency, order, and control over chaos. His early success came not from luxury, but from practicality, as he made his first fortune lifting and relocating buildings in Chicago after the city raised its street level to combat flooding, an operation that required precision, discipline, and absolute coordination. These qualities would come to define Pullman's worldview. To him, disorder was not merely inconvenient, it was dangerous. As railroads expanded across America, Pullman identified both an opportunity and a problem. Long-distance train travel was booming, but it was uncomfortable, exhausting, and unpredictable. His solution was the Pullman sleeping car, a meticulously designed space that transformed rail travel into something efficient, standardized, and profitable. The success of the Pullman Company made him immensely wealthy, but it also reinforced his belief that systems functioned best when human behavior was carefully managed. Pullman did not see himself as a tyrant. He saw himself as a rational organizer of society, convinced that workers, left to their own devices, produced instability, inefficiency, and moral decline. He believed that by shaping their environment, where they lived, how they spent their money, and how they behaved, conflict could be eliminated before it ever began. This philosophy was deeply paternalistic, rooted in the idea that authority, when exercised by enlightened industrial leaders, was not oppression, but benevolence. Pullman viewed labor unrest, strikes, and urban poverty not as consequences of inequality, but as failures of planning and discipline. In his mind, the factory alone was insufficient to guarantee productivity. The city itself had to be engineered. Housing had to be clean, orderly, and supervised. Leisure had to be respectable and regulated. Alcohol, political agitation, and unsanctioned gatherings were threats to stability and therefore had no place in his ideal society. Pullman believed that workers would be grateful for this structure, that they would trade autonomy for security, and that in doing so, they would become more efficient, more loyal, and more predictable. What Pullman failed to recognize was that his vision left no room for dissent, no space for ownership, and no acknowledgement of workers as independent adults capable of governing their own lives. To him, people were components within a larger industrial machine, and like any machine, they needed oversight, maintenance, and control. This belief hardened as his power grew. By the time Pullman conceived of building an entire town south of Chicago in the 1880s, he was no longer experimenting. He was implementing a fully formed ideology. The city of Pullman was not an afterthought to the factory, but its logical extension. A controlled environment designed to reinforce obedience, suppress conflict, and align every aspect of daily life with the interests of the company. Pullman's confidence was unshakable. He was praised by politicians, admired by fellow industrialists, and celebrated in the press as a model capitalist who cared for his workers. Yet beneath this admiration lay a dangerous assumption. That order imposed from above was inherently superior to freedom negotiated from below. Pullman never questioned whether workers wanted to live in a world designed entirely by their employer, because in his mind, the success of the system was proof enough. This conviction, rooted in efficiency and authority rather than empathy and consent, would shape every brick laid in the city that bore his name, and it would ultimately determine not only the fate of Pullman the town, but the legacy of Pullman the man. A figure who believed he was building a better society, while quietly constructing the conditions for its collapse. Chapter 2. Why the factory came first. The factory came first because, in late 19th century America, industry was not built around people, but around demand, speed, and profit. And Pullman understood this reality better than most of his contemporaries. By the 1870s and 1880s, the United States was transforming at a relentless pace, driven by railroads that stitched together distant cities and fueled an economy hungry for movement. Steel, coal, and steam powered a nation expanding westward, and rail travel was no longer a luxury reserved for elites, but a necessity for commerce, migration, and control of territory. Yet long-distance train journeys remained harsh and uncomfortable, exposing a critical weakness in the system. George Pullman recognized that solving this problem was not merely about improving comfort, it was about standardization. The Pullman sleeping car was designed to be uniform, efficient, and scalable, a product that could be replicated across the growing rail network with predictable costs and reliable returns. Demand exploded, contracts multiplied, and the Pullman Company grew into one of the most important manufacturers in the American transportation industry. To sustain this growth, Pullman required something more than skilled labor. He required stability. Factories of this scale could not afford interruptions, delays, or strikes. Production schedules depended on disciplined workers who arrived on time, followed rules, and remained loyal to the company that employed them. In an era marked by frequent labor unrest, violent strikes, and political radicalism, industrialists increasingly viewed the workforce itself as a variable that needed to be controlled. For Pullman, the factory was the core engine of wealth, and everything else existed to serve it. The location south of Chicago was chosen not for community, but for logistics, access to rail lines, proximity to raw materials, and distance from the disorder of the city. The factory was built as a self-contained system designed to maximize efficiency and minimize unpredictability, and once it stood, the question was no longer how to employ workers, but how to manage them. Housing followed production, not the other way around. Workers were brought in to serve the factory's needs, and the town was conceived as an extension of the industrial process itself. Pullman believed that if the factory dictated the rhythm of work, the city must dictate the rhythm of life. This logic reflected a broader industrial philosophy of the era, one that prioritized output over autonomy and viewed human labor as a resource to be optimized. Wages were calculated as costs, housing as an instrument of discipline, and daily routines as mechanisms for maintaining order. By placing the factory at the center of the system, Pullman ensured that economic dependency would shape every other decision. Workers could not easily leave without losing not only their jobs, but their homes and social standing. The factory's dominance made dissent risky and compliance practical. To Pullman, this was not cruelty but efficiency. He believed that a stable workforce produced better products, and that a controlled environment reduced conflict. The factory came first because it represented certainty in an uncertain world, a fixed point around which all other elements could be arranged. Yet this approach carried an inherent contradiction. By designing a system where the factory's needs overrode human considerations, Pullman created a community that functioned only as long as prosperity remained uninterrupted. When economic conditions shifted, when demand faltered, or when workers questioned the fairness of the system, the imbalance became impossible to ignore. The factory that had justified the creation of the town also became the force that exposed its fragility. In building Pullman around production rather than people, George Pullman laid the foundation for a system that could expand rapidly but adapt poorly, a system whose efficiency depended on obedience and whose stability depended on silence. The factory came first because it was the source of power, and in Pullman's vision, power was never meant to be shared. Chapter 3: Designing a Controlled Utopia. Designing Pullman was not an act of philanthropy or social idealism, but a deliberate exercise in control, one that treated urban planning as a tool for shaping human behavior in service of industrial efficiency. When construction of the town began in the early 1880s, every element was carefully calculated to reflect George Pullman's belief that order could be engineered and conflict eliminated through environment alone. Architects and planners were instructed to create a city that appeared humane, progressive, and orderly, while functioning as a closed system governed entirely by corporate authority. Streets were laid out with precision, wide and clean, designed not only for movement, but for visibility, ensuring that the town could be easily observed and regulated. Housing was constructed in uniform blocks. Their appearance subtly varied according to occupational rank, embedding social hierarchy directly into the physical landscape. Skilled workers lived in modest but well-maintained homes, while managers occupied larger residences with better amenities, reinforcing class distinctions without the need for explicit rules. At the center of the town stood the factory itself, dominating the skyline both physically and symbolically, a constant reminder that all life in Pullman revolved around production. Public buildings were positioned with equal intention. Churches promoted moral discipline and obedience. Schools prepared children for future roles within the industrial system, and company-owned markets ensured that consumption remained internal, circulating wages back into corporate hands. Pullman's planners believed deeply in the idea that environment shaped character, and that by controlling surroundings, one could control behavior. Alcohol was prohibited, not simply as a moral stance, but as a preventative measure against disorder and dissent. Independent businesses were discouraged or outright banned, eliminating alternative sources of income and influence. Political meetings, labor organizing, and unsanctioned gatherings were restricted not through visible force, but through policies embedded into leases and town regulations, making resistance administratively impossible rather than violently suppressed. Leisure itself was regulated. Recreation was permitted only in approved forms, designed to appear generous while remaining predictable and non-threatening. Parks and green spaces softened the visual impact of control, creating an illusion of freedom within boundaries that could not be crossed. Visitors to Pullman often praised its cleanliness, quiet streets, and apparent harmony, citing it as evidence that industrial capitalism could coexist with social order. What they rarely acknowledged was that this harmony was maintained through dependency rather than consent. Every resident rented from the company. Rent, utilities, and services were controlled by Pullman administrators, often deducted directly from wages, ensuring that economic dependence remained constant and unavoidable. Workers did not own their homes, their land, or their businesses, and this absence of ownership was not accidental. By denying workers property, Pullman eliminated alternative forms of security that might allow independence or dissent. The town functioned smoothly precisely because there were no competing centers of power, no local governance, and no mechanisms for collective decision-making. Complaints were treated as inefficiencies rather than grievances, addressed only when they threatened productivity. Pullman believed sincerely that this arrangement was beneficial, that workers would trade autonomy for stability, and that stability would produce loyalty. Yet beneath the surface of this controlled utopia lay a profound imbalance. The same system that provided clean housing and orderly streets also stripped residents of agency, reducing adulthood to compliance and responsibility to obedience. Decisions about rent increases, housing conditions, and town rules were made unilaterally, without consultation or representation, leaving workers with no meaningful voice in the place they called home. Silence was interpreted as satisfaction, and conformity mistaken for contentment. The town's success depended entirely on uninterrupted prosperity and unquestioned authority. The moment hardship entered the system, the lack of ownership and representation would transform order into resentment. By designing a city where control was embedded into architecture, policy, and daily routine, Pullman created an environment that appeared benevolent while functioning as an extension of the factory floor. The utopia he envisioned was never meant to empower its residents, only to stabilize production and suppress unpredictability. And in doing so, Pullman revealed the central flaw of corporate utopianism. A society engineered without consent may appear efficient, orderly, and humane, but it remains inherently fragile, sustained not by loyalty, but by the quiet pressure of control. Chapter 4. Life inside the company. Life inside the company town of Pullman was defined not by chaos or visible oppression, but by routine, regulation, and an ever-present sense of conditional stability. For the workers who lived there, daily life followed a rhythm set not by personal choice, but by the needs of the factory and the rules of the company. Mornings began early, as men left their identical rows of houses and walked the same streets toward the massive industrial complex that dominated the town's horizon. The factory whistle did not simply signal the start of work. It structured time itself, dividing the day into periods of labor and rest determined entirely by production schedules. Homes were clean, orderly, and well-maintained, often superior to the crowded and unsanitary housing found in nearby industrial cities, and this contrast was frequently cited by Pullman supporters as proof of benevolence. Yet these houses were never truly homes. Workers could not decorate freely, make alterations, or invite activities deemed inappropriate by company standards. Inspections were common, and residents understood that failure to comply with expectations could result in warnings, fines, or eviction. Rent was paid to the same company that issued wages, often deducted automatically, leaving little room for financial independence. Stores, utilities, and services were owned or controlled by Pullman administrators, ensuring that most money earned within the town circulated back into corporate hands. Leisure existed, but only within narrow boundaries. Alcohol was prohibited. not simply discouraged, and any behavior associated with disorder was treated as a threat to the town's stability. Social gatherings were monitored, political discussions discouraged, and labor organizing viewed with suspicion. Churches and schools played a central role in shaping acceptable behavior, reinforcing values of discipline, respectability, and obedience. Children were educated within a system designed to prepare them for future roles as compliant workers, while adults were expected to maintain lives free of controversy and dissent. On the surface, Pullman appeared calm, even peaceful. Crime rates were low, streets were quiet, and visitors often remarked on the town's order and cleanliness. But beneath this calm lay a constant awareness that security was conditional. Employment meant housing, and housing meant compliance. A disagreement with management could cost not only a job, but a place to live. This dependency created a subtle but powerful form of control, one that did not require violence to be effective. Workers learned to self-regulate, to avoid drawing attention, and to accept decisions made without their input. Even moments of rest carried the weight of oversight, as leisure spaces were designed to be respectable and predictable, offering relaxation without freedom. Over time, this environment shaped behavior and expectations. Some residents appreciated the stability, believing that the trade of autonomy for security was reasonable in an uncertain industrial economy. Others felt suffocated by the lack of ownership and voice, quietly resenting a system that treated adults as children and loyalty as obligation. Complaints about rent, repairs, or policies were often dismissed as ingratitude, reinforcing the idea that comfort was a privilege rather than a right. The absence of visible conflict was mistaken for harmony, and silence was interpreted as consent. Yet daily life in Pullman was lived under the constant reminder that everything, work, shelter, community, could be taken away. The town functioned smoothly because it left no space for negotiation, no mechanism for collective decision-making, and no path toward independence. Life inside the company town was orderly, predictable, and carefully managed, but it was also fragile, sustained by compliance rather than trust. This controlled stability would endure only as long as economic conditions remained favorable and authority went unchallenged. When hardship arrived, the routines that once maintained order would become sources of frustration, and the quiet discipline of daily life would reveal itself as the foundation of a much deeper unrest. Chapter 5: Rent, Wages, and Invisible Chains. In Pullman, control did not rely on guards, fences, or visible force, but on a carefully constructed economic system in which wages and rent formed invisible chains that bound workers to the company with remarkable efficiency. At first glance, the arrangement appeared straightforward. The Pullman Company paid its workers steady wages, and in return those workers paid rent for clean, well-maintained housing in the town. Yet this apparent balance concealed a deeper imbalance of power. The same entity that determined wages also set rent prices, utility fees, and service costs, leaving workers with no meaningful leverage or alternative. Rent was often deducted directly from paychecks, ensuring that money flowed from the company to the worker and back again in a closed loop that was nearly impossible to escape. Unlike independent towns, where housing markets allowed choice and negotiation, Pullman offered none. Workers could not seek cheaper accommodations nearby without losing access to the town and often their jobs. Rent levels were set higher than those in surrounding areas, justified by the quality of housing and infrastructure, but they consumed a significant portion of workers' income, reducing savings and limiting mobility. This system transformed housing from shelter into a mechanism of discipline. A worker who questioned management, complained about conditions, or attracted unwanted attention risked not only dismissal, but eviction, a threat that extended economic control into the most intimate aspects of life. During periods of prosperity, this dependency was masked by regular pay and relative comfort. But when economic conditions shifted, the fragility of the system became impossible to ignore. The Panic of 1893 sent shockwaves through American industry, sharply reducing demand for rail cars and forcing companies to cut costs. Pullman responded by reducing wages, in some cases by as much as 30%, while leaving rent and other charges unchanged. For workers, this decision revealed the true nature of the system. Income fell, but expenses remained fixed, trapping families in a cycle of debt and anxiety. Paychecks shrank, yet the company continued to collect rent with the same efficiency as before, reinforcing the sense that the town existed not to support its residents, but to protect corporate revenue. Workers found themselves working longer hours for less pay, only to see much of it reclaimed by the same employer. The promise of stability had become a burden, and the security once offered by the company town now felt like confinement. What made these chains particularly effective was their invisibility. There were no contracts openly declaring subservience, no explicit rules forbidding dissent. Instead, economic dependency did the work quietly. The threat of homelessness silenced complaints, while the absence of alternatives discouraged resistance. Even basic necessities, water, heat, and access to stores, were controlled by the company, reinforcing the sense that survival itself depended on compliance. Pullman's administrators viewed this arrangement as rational management, a system designed to ensure order and predictability. From their perspective, the workers who struggled financially had failed to adapt, not been wronged. This framing shifted responsibility away from the structure of the system and onto the individuals trapped within it. Over time, resentment grew, fueled not by sudden oppression, but by the slow realization that there was no path forward within the town. Hard work did not lead to ownership, loyalty did not lead to security, and obedience did not guarantee fairness. The economic logic that once seemed efficient now appeared exploitative, revealing how control could be exercised without overt coercion. In Pullman, wages gave the illusion of independence, while rent ensured dependence. Together, they formed a system of invisible chains, binding workers to the company not through fear alone, but through necessity. This quiet form of control would prove more destabilizing than force, because when workers finally recognized it, they understood that the system was designed not to support them, but to contain them. And once that understanding spread, the foundation of the company town began to crack. Chapter 6. The illusion begins to fade. For years, the system at Pullman had survived on perception as much as policy, sustained by the belief that order equaled fairness and stability was proof of benevolence. But slowly and quietly, that illusion began to fade. The early praise that once surrounded the company town no longer matched the daily experiences of the people who lived there. What had been presented as a model of progress increasingly felt like a rigid structure that allowed no adjustment, no negotiation, and no acknowledgement of human limits. Workers began to notice the contradiction at the heart of Pullman's promise. While the town demanded discipline, loyalty, and gratitude, it offered no path toward independence or shared prosperity. Small frustrations accumulated over time: unresolved maintenance issues, arbitrary enforcement of rules, dismissive responses from management, each incident insignificant on its own, but collectively eroding trust. Conversations that once remained private began to surface in public spaces, in quiet exchanges after shifts, and in cautious discussions among neighbors who had learned to weigh every word. The language of gratitude slowly gave way to the language of comparison. As workers looked beyond Pullman and realized that other industrial towns, imperfect as they were, allowed choice, ownership, and the possibility of dissent. the sense of moral authority that the company claimed no longer felt absolute. Workers began to question why clean housing justified high rents, why obedience was expected without representation, and why a system that claimed to care for its people refused to listen to them. Labor organizations, previously dismissed as disruptive or unnecessary, started to appear less threatening and more practical, offering a vocabulary for grievances that had long gone unnamed. Pullman's administrators, accustomed to compliance, interpreted this shift as ingratitude rather than warning, reinforcing policies instead of adapting them. The town's silence, once mistaken for contentment, became strained and brittle. Even those who appreciated the stability Pullman provided sensed that something was wrong, that security without agency carried an unspoken cost. The illusion of harmony depended on prosperity and predictability, and as economic pressures mounted across the nation, that foundation weakened. Rumors of wage cuts, production slowdowns, and layoffs circulated through the factory floors, creating anxiety that the company's carefully managed order could not contain. When wages were reduced without consultation while rents remained fixed, the moral contract that Pullman claimed to uphold fractured visibly. Workers no longer saw the system as strict but fair. They saw it as unyielding and indifferent. The town's design, once admired for its efficiency, now felt suffocating, its uniformity a reminder of how little control residents had over their own lives. Surveillance no longer felt protective but intrusive. Rules once justified as safeguards appeared arbitrary and self-serving. The belief that management knew best began to erode, replaced by the realization that decisions were made to preserve profit, not dignity. What made this moment dangerous was not anger alone, but clarity. Workers did not erupt immediately into open resistance. Instead, they began to understand the system as it truly was. The illusion faded not in a single dramatic collapse, but through a gradual awakening, as people recognized that the promises of the company town were conditional and revocable. This shift in perception marked a point of no return. Once workers understood that stability was not guaranteed and loyalty was not rewarded, the psychological foundation of Pullman began to crumble. The town could no longer rely on compliance born of belief. It now depended on fear and necessity alone. And history has shown that systems sustained only by those forces are inherently unstable. As the illusion dissolved, Pullman stood at a dangerous threshold, its orderly surface concealing a growing readiness for confrontation, and the quiet discipline that had maintained control for so long began to transform into something far more volatile. Chapter 7. The Panic of 1893. The Panic of 1893 did not arrive in Pullman as a sudden catastrophe, but as a slow, relentless tightening that exposed every weakness hidden beneath the town's carefully managed order. Across the United States, the industrial economy began to unravel as railroad overexpansion, collapsing credit, and failing banks triggered one of the most severe economic depressions of the 19th century. Railroads, once symbols of endless growth, suddenly became liabilities, and demand for new rail cars fell sharply as companies canceled contracts and halted expansion. For the Pullman Company, whose fortunes were tied directly to rail travel, the impact was immediate and profound. Production slowed, orders disappeared, and the certainty that had sustained the company town began to dissolve. In response, Pullman's management turned inward, focusing not on shared sacrifice, but on protecting the company's financial structure. Wages were reduced, sometimes dramatically, without consultation or warning, justified as a necessary adjustment to market conditions. Yet while paychecks shrank, rents did not. Housing costs, utility fees, and service charges remained fixed, reinforcing the imbalance that workers had long sensed but could now no longer ignore. Families found themselves trapped between falling income and immovable expenses, struggling to afford food, heat, and basic necessities in a town that allowed no alternatives. Savings vanished, debts accumulated, and anxiety became a constant presence in daily life. The economic crisis stripped away the illusion that Pullman's system was designed to protect its residents. Instead, it revealed a structure optimized to preserve revenue, regardless of human cost. Workers who had accepted strict rules in exchange for stability now faced instability without recourse. Complaints about rent and wages were dismissed as unavoidable consequences of the market, even as the company continued to collect payments with unwavering efficiency. The same administrative discipline that had once produced order now appeared callous, treating hardship as a failure of individuals rather than a flaw in the system. The Depression also altered perception. What had once been framed as paternal care now felt like exploitation, as workers recognized that their dependence left them vulnerable to decisions made entirely without their input. The Panic of 1893 did more than reduce wages. It transformed fear into anger and resignation into awareness. Men who had avoided confrontation began to speak openly about unfairness, comparing their situation to workers elsewhere who, despite harsher living conditions, retained some degree of choice and autonomy. The town's design, once praised for its efficiency, now intensified suffering by eliminating flexibility. There were no cheaper homes to move into, no independent employers to turn to, and no local government to appeal to. Pullman's residents were enclosed within an economic system that offered discipline but no resilience. As the crisis deepened, layoffs and shortened work weeks further eroded confidence, and the factory whistle that once structured life now signaled uncertainty rather than purpose. Management's refusal to reduce rents or negotiate wages became a defining moment, crystallizing resentment into collective grievance. The Depression had exposed the fundamental truth of the company town, that its stability was conditional on prosperity, and that when prosperity vanished, control remained. The Panic of 1893 was not merely an external shock. It was the stress test that Pullman's system could not pass. By forcing workers to absorb the full impact of economic collapse while the company preserved its authority, the crisis transformed dissatisfaction into determination. The carefully maintained order of Pullman did not collapse immediately, but it cracked decisively, and through those cracks emerged a shared understanding that the system would not correct itself. As hardship spread and patience eroded, the town moved inexorably toward confrontation, its residents no longer willing to endure a structure that demanded obedience while offering no protection. The Depression had stripped Pullman of its moral legitimacy, leaving behind a community that was disciplined, desperate, and increasingly prepared to resist. Chapter 8: The Pullman Strike. The Pullman strike did not begin as a revolutionary act, but as a final response to a system that had exhausted every other option, emerging from desperation rather than ideology. By the spring of 1894, months of wage cuts without rent reductions had pushed Pullman workers to a breaking point. Families were hungry, debts were mounting, and the promise of stability that once justified obedience had fully collapsed. When a delegation of workers attempted to negotiate with Pullman management, requesting modest concessions and recognition of their grievances, they were dismissed without dialogue, reinforcing the belief that the company no longer saw them as partners in production, but as liabilities to be managed. In May 1894, thousands of Pullman employees walked off the job, halting production at the factory and signaling a rupture that could no longer be contained within the company town. What transformed this local strike into a national crisis was the involvement of the American Railway Union, led by Eugene V. Debs, which called for a boycott of trains carrying Pullman cars. Rail workers across the country refused to handle Pullman equipment, effectively paralyzing large portions of the nation's rail network. Freight stalled, passenger service collapsed, and the arteries of American commerce began to seize. What had started as a dispute over wages and rent now threatened the flow of goods, mail, and movement across the entire country. Railroad companies responded with coordinated force, framing the strike not as a labor dispute, but as an attack on national order and economic stability. Federal authorities soon adopted the same narrative. President Grover Cleveland's administration intervened, citing the disruption of mail delivery and interstate commerce as justification for federal action. Troops were deployed to Chicago, turning the strike into a confrontation between workers and the state itself. The presence of soldiers escalated tensions dramatically. Violent clashes erupted between strikers and armed forces. Rail yards were set ablaze, and dozens of people were killed or injured as order was imposed through force. Eugene Debs was arrested, union leadership was dismantled, and the strike was systematically broken. For Pullman workers, the outcome was devastating. The factory reopened under the company's terms. Many strikers were blacklisted, and the promise of reform dissolved into punishment and exclusion. Yet the significance of the Pullman strike extended far beyond its immediate defeat. It exposed the alignment between corporate power and government authority, revealing how quickly economic disputes could be reframed as threats to national security. The strike demonstrated that the company town was not an isolated experiment, but part of a broader system in which industrial capital, transportation infrastructure, and political power were deeply intertwined. Public opinion shifted as reports of violence and hardship circulated, and investigations later condemned Pullman's refusal to reduce rents as a contributing factor to the conflict. While the strike failed to achieve its immediate goals, it succeeded in something more enduring. It shattered the myth that Pullman's system was benevolent and voluntary. The carefully engineered order of the company town had required military force to maintain, exposing its reliance on coercion rather than consent. The Pullman strike became a defining moment in American labor history, illustrating the limits of corporate paternalism and the consequences of concentrating economic, social, and political power in a single institution. It marked the moment when Pullman's controlled utopia was revealed to the nation not as a model to be replicated, but as a warning of what happens when efficiency is valued above dignity. The strike ended with the workers defeated, but the idea that had sustained the company town was irreversibly broken. Control had replaced care, force had replaced legitimacy, and the silence that once defined Pullman had been replaced by a confrontation that echoed far beyond its streets, reshaping the national conversation about labor, power, and the true cost of industrial order. Chapter 9. A System Exposed. In the months following the Pullman strike, the illusion that had protected the company town for more than a decade finally collapsed under the weight of national attention. And what emerged from the ruins was not merely a labor dispute, but the exposure of an entire system built on invisible domination. Newspapers that once praised Pullman as a triumph of enlightened capitalism now published testimonies from workers describing lives governed by rules they had no role in creating, rents they could not negotiate, and punishments delivered without appeal. Federal investigations peeled back the polished image of red brick housing and manicured streets, revealing a town where citizenship did not exist, only tenancy, where residents were not neighbors but assets managed for efficiency. The strike had forced the nation to ask an uncomfortable question. Could a corporation be allowed to function as a government, exercising economic, social, and moral authority over thousands of lives without democratic accountability? The answer, delivered slowly through court rulings and public condemnation, was increasingly clear. In 1898, the Illinois Supreme Court ruled that the Pullman Company could no longer own and operate the town, declaring that a private corporation had no legal right to assume municipal powers. This decision did more than dismantle Pullman's control. it publicly invalidated the philosophical foundation of the company town itself. The ruling reframed Pullman's experiment not as a failed utopia, but as an overreach of corporate power that violated the principles of American civic life. George Pullman's personal reputation suffered irreparable damage. Once celebrated as a visionary industrialist, he was now portrayed as a symbol of paternalistic arrogance, a man who believed order could replace justice and design could substitute consent. His refusal to lower rents during the economic collapse of 1893 became the central moral indictment against him, cited repeatedly as evidence that the system was never built to protect workers, only to stabilize profits. Even critics of organized labor found it difficult to defend a model that demanded sacrifice from employees while shielding the company from shared hardship. The exposure of Pullman resonated far beyond Chicago, transforming the strike into a national case study in the dangers of unchecked industrial authority. Labor reformers used Pullman as proof that dependency disguised as benevolence inevitably produced resentment and revolt. Progressive thinkers pointed to the town as evidence that economic power, when allowed to merge with civic control, eroded the foundations of democracy. The Pullman strike itself had been crushed, but its aftermath reshaped public discourse, accelerating demands for labor rights, collective bargaining, and clearer boundaries between corporate influence and public governance. The company town was no longer discussed as a solution to industrial unrest, but as a warning. Pullman's carefully engineered harmony was revealed to be fragile, maintained not by loyalty, but by constraint. Not by community, but by the absence of alternatives. The exposure was not sudden, but cumulative, built from court records, eyewitness accounts, and the undeniable fact that a system claiming to eliminate conflict had instead produced one of the most explosive confrontations in American labor history. By the end of the decade, Pullman no longer represented the future of industrial America. It represented a path not to be repeated. The system had been exposed at every level, legal, moral, and ideological, and once stripped of its aesthetic defenses, it stood naked as a mechanism of control that mistook obedience for stability. What Pullman revealed to a nation entering the 20th century was a fundamental truth. Efficiency without agency breeds resistance, and a society designed without the consent of those who live within it cannot survive its first real crisis. Chapter 10. When the city was taken away. When the city of Pullman was finally taken away from the company that created it, the event did not arrive with drama or violence, but with paperwork, court orders, and the quiet dismantling of an idea that had once claimed to represent the future of industrial America. In the years following the Illinois Supreme Court ruling, the Pullman Company was forced to do what George Pullman had resisted from the beginning: surrender control. The town was no longer allowed to exist as a private domain governed by corporate decree. Streets, utilities, and public spaces were transferred to municipal authority, and Pullman was gradually absorbed into the expanding city of Chicago. This transition marked the formal end of the company town experiment, but it also exposed how hollow the original vision had become. Without corporate oversight, the mechanisms that once enforced order vanished almost overnight. Rents were no longer dictated by the company. Rules were no longer enforced by supervisors disguised as landlords, and residents were no longer tenants, living under constant evaluation. For the first time, Pullman's inhabitants gained access to civic rights that had been deliberately withheld: representation, local governance, and the ability to challenge decisions that shaped their daily lives. Yet freedom arrived without celebration. The town that had been engineered for stability struggled to adapt to autonomy. Buildings designed for uniformity aged poorly. Infrastructure required public investment, and the sense of imposed harmony dissolved into something more fragile and human. George Pullman did not live to see the full transformation. He died in 1897, widely disliked. His funeral attended under heavy guard amid fears of public outrage. His death symbolized the collapse of a philosophy that believed authority could substitute empathy, and control could replace trust. As Pullman faded into history, the physical city remained, stripped of its original purpose. What had once been a showcase of industrial paternalism became an ordinary neighborhood, its red brick buildings standing as silent witnesses to an era when corporations believed they could design society itself. The absorption of Pullman into Chicago was more than an administrative act. It was a cultural verdict. It signaled that the American public had rejected the idea that a single employer could own not just labor, but life beyond the factory gates. Reformers cited Pullman's dissolution as proof that economic power must be constrained by civic oversight, and that communities could not thrive without consent. The company town, once marketed as a cure for labor unrest, was now remembered as a failed experiment that underestimated human agency. Even as the Pullman Company continued manufacturing rail cars, its moral authority was permanently diminished. The city it lost became its most enduring legacy, not as a triumph, but as a cautionary monument. Over time, Pullman's story was absorbed into broader narratives about labor rights, urban planning, and the limits of corporate influence. The streets remained. The factory stood for decades longer, but the illusion was gone. What had been taken away was not merely ownership, but legitimacy. The city had outgrown its creator, and in doing so exposed the fundamental flaw at the heart of the company town. A community cannot be engineered into obedience without eventually demanding its own voice. When Pullman was taken away, America did not simply reclaim a neighborhood. It reclaimed the principle that cities belong to the people who live in them, not the systems that seek to control them.